You wake to the sound of wood moving somewhere in the darkness. Not footsteps, not voices, just the slow, deliberate creak of a mechanism being prepared. Your wrists are already restrained. The room is cold. Stone surrounds you on every side. There is no clock, no window, nothing that tells you how much time has passed. Then you hear a second sound, metal turning against wood. Someone is standing behind you. You cannot see what they are doing, but you understand what the sound means. This is not an accident. It is a procedure, and in a few seconds your body will become part of it. For most of human history, punishment was not simply about causing pain. It was about control. The body was made into a message, a public spectacle, a warning, a demonstration of what happened when a person crossed a line drawn by a ruler, a court, a religion, or a society. And some of these punishments were designed around a disturbing idea that pain itself was not enough. The victim had to understand that it could continue. That was the real terror, the uncertainty, the waiting, the knowledge that someone else controlled what happened next. One of the most infamous devices associated with this world was the rack, or Streckbank. The basic principle was brutally simple. A person was restrained while a mechanical system gradually pulled the body in opposing directions. The mechanism itself was not complicated. That was precisely what made it so disturbing. There was no need for extraordinary technology, only ropes, restraints, a frame, and someone willing to keep turning the mechanism. And that reveals something important about historical torture. The most terrifying systems were often not technologically sophisticated. They were psychologically sophisticated. The victim knew that every movement of the mechanism had a purpose, and the person operating it could stop or continue. That distinction mattered, because pain becomes something different when another human being has complete control over its duration. But the rack was only one part of a much larger history. In medieval and early modern Europe, another punishment became infamous under the name breaking wheel, or Radbrechen. The wheel was not simply an instrument. It became a symbol. The condemned person could be restrained while executioners inflicted severe injuries to the limbs using heavy implements. The details varied enormously by place and period. So did the exact procedure, but the underlying message remained remarkably consistent. The punishment was meant to be witnessed. The suffering was not hidden. It was displayed. And that is where punishment becomes something larger than violence. It becomes theater. A crowd watches. A condemned person is placed at the center. And everyone else learns the same lesson. This is what happens when the authority above you decides that your body belongs to the punishment. The strange thing is that people often imagine historical cruelty as something primitive, something belonging to a distant world that no longer resembles our own. But that assumption collapses when you look more closely. Because the people who designed these punishments understood something about human psychology that modern societies still understand. Fear does not require constant pain. Sometimes anticipation is enough, sometimes the imagination does most of the work. And perhaps no historical punishment demonstrates the transformation of a human being into a symbol more clearly than impalement, or Pfählung. It appeared in different forms across different regions and periods. It became particularly associated in popular culture with Vlad III, often called Vlad the Impaler. But the historical reality is more complicated than the legend. Impalement was not one standardized procedure used everywhere in exactly the same way. Its methods and meanings varied. What remained consistent was the message. The body itself became the warning. A person was no longer merely being punished. The person was being transformed into an object lesson. And once punishment becomes a public message, suffering is no longer only about the victim. It is also about everyone watching. That may be the most unsettling part. Because the punishment is designed to continue long after the person is gone. The memory remains, the image remains, the fear remains. And the society remembers what happened to the person who crossed the boundary. But there was another weapon that required something far simpler than machinery. Water, the method often described as water torture, or Wasserfolter, existed in various historical forms, and accounts differ considerably depending on period and source. The basic concept was simple. A restrained person was subjected to forced or controlled exposure to water under circumstances designed to create extreme distress. The important detail is not the water itself. It is the loss of control. You cannot decide when it stops. You cannot control the next moment. You cannot negotiate with the mechanism. And that is a recurring principle throughout the history of torture. The human body can endure extraordinary conditions, but the mind reacts differently when it cannot predict what comes next. This is why historical punishments were often carefully structured around anticipation. The waiting, the preparation, the restraints, the presence of witnesses, the sound of tools being moved into position. Everything before the punishment could become part of the punishment itself. And then there are devices whose reputations have become larger than the historical evidence behind them. The most famous example may be the Iron Maiden, or Eiserne Jungfrau. Popular culture presents it as a medieval torture device, a metal coffin lined with spikes, supposedly used to slowly kill its victim. The image is unforgettable. The problem is that the historical evidence does not support the idea that Iron Maidens were a widespread medieval torture instrument in the way popular culture suggests. Many surviving examples appeared much later. Some were associated with 19th century displays and sensationalized interpretations of medieval history. And this distinction matters, because history is frightening enough without inventing horrors. Sometimes the truth is more disturbing than the legend. Human beings did not need elaborate machines to create suffering. They needed authority. They needed fear. And they needed a society willing to accept the punishment as legitimate. That is the deeper pattern beneath these methods. The rack, the breaking wheel, impalement, water torture, each was different, but each transformed the body into a place where power could be demonstrated. And once you understand that, the question changes. It is no longer, how much pain could a person survive? The more disturbing question is, what happens to the human mind when survival itself is no longer under its own control? Because pain has a limit, fear does not. A person can count seconds. They can hold their breath. They can focus on a single thought. But uncertainty has no obvious endpoint, and history repeatedly discovered ways to exploit that fact. The punishment could become a waiting room, a room in which nothing happens for minutes or hours. And yet the victim knows that something will happen. That knowledge changes time itself. A second becomes longer, a minute becomes enormous, the future becomes a threat. And suddenly the most powerful instrument in the room is not the wheel, the rope, or the mechanism. It is anticipation. Perhaps that is why the history of punishment remains so difficult to look away from. It tells us something uncomfortable about civilization. We like to imagine that cruelty belongs to monsters. But history rarely gives us monsters. It gives us institutions, officials, courts, crowds, orders, procedures, and ordinary people performing extraordinary acts because a system has told them those acts are justified. The most disturbing lesson is therefore not that humans once invented terrible punishments. It is that humans were capable of making those punishments feel normal. A procedure could be written down. A sentence could be pronounced. A mechanism could be prepared. A crowd could gather. And then the violence could begin, not in chaos, but in order. And perhaps that is what makes the question, could you survive history's worst punishments, so difficult to answer. Because survival was never the only thing being tested. The punishment was testing something else. How long could a person remain themselves when control over their own body had been taken away? How long could hope survive when there was no certainty that the suffering would end? And how much fear could a society create before fear itself became a form of government? We often think history is behind us, a collection of dates, names, battles, kings, dead civilizations. But history is also a record of what human beings are capable of doing to one another when power, fear, and obedience align. The stone rooms are gone. The mechanisms are museum pieces. The crowds have disappeared. But the question remains. Not whether we would survive the rack, not whether we could endure the breaking wheel, not whether we could escape the terror of impalement. The deeper question is whether we recognize the human psychology that made those punishments possible. Because the most frightening thing about history is not that people were different from us, it is how often they were not. And somewhere in that realization is the reason these old punishments still disturb us. We are not looking at another species. We are looking at ourselves, just separated by time.